discovery of the palace of Philip V was a fortuitous accident in the last days of the 2011 excavation season. We had spent nearly the entire summer excavating in sectors 3 and 7 and on the middle terrace. With just 3 days left in the dig, one team finished their excavation on the middle terrace and asked if they could return to a trench in sector 6 that was left unfinished in 2010. We agreed, but we really didn't hold out great hopes for that particular trench. But by the end of the first day in that trench, they had uncovered a corner of a building. Two things immediately got our attention. The first was that the two walls joined one another at a 105-degree angle, not the usual 90-degree angle of Hellenic architecture. The second was that the lower course of stones was of finely cut ashlars. Now, normally at Bylazora, the walls were made either of roughly shaped out field stones or fairly amorphous boulders. The only exception to this is the sacred pool of Sector 4. Anyway, we used the last 2 days of the 2011 season to open trenches in line with these two walls.
In 2012, we continued opening trenches along the line of the east-west wall, and on the last day of the dig of that season, we found an entranceway and two unfinished Corinthian capitals, which we discussed in video chapter 6. The walls we had discovered in 2011 are two of the outer walls of what we believe to be the palace of the Macedonian king Philip V, built after Philip conquered Bylazora in 217 BC and fortified the city. This palace, we should imagine, is a combination of a royal residence and a garrison post, much like the other Macedonian palaces at Aigai and Demetrius. From the existence of the Corinthian capitals and from the array of pottery dating from the 5th to 2nd centuries BC, we concluded that our structure was in use in the last days of an independent kingdom of Macedonia. This could be, we thought, what Polybius was referring to when he wrote about Philip V's fortification of Bylazora. In the 2013 season, we were able to expand our trenches in all directions, and we ended up uncovering a significant portion of one wing of the palace.
The exterior wall of this wing of the palace was constructed of finely cut ashlars. For most of its length, only 1 or 2 courses are preserved. But near the monumental stairway and in the vestibule, 4 or 5 courses are preserved. The wall rests on a stereopate course and a toikobate course of smaller cut stones. Although in the Hellenistic era many buildings in this part of the world were constructed of mud brick atop stone foundations, we don't believe that this is the case here at Bylazora. We found ample evidence inside the palace that some of the walls were made of mud brick, but we did not find any fragments of burnt mud brick along the outside of the walls to suggest that their superstructure was brick. We believe these outside walls were constructed of cut stones to their total height.
The entrance to the palace was up a monumental stairway of 5 steps that led into a vestibule. The facade of the vestibule was of the Corinthian order. We discussed this in great detail in chapter 6. The architecture of the facade suggested to us a date of some time after the mid-3rd century BC, since we had found all the elements of a fully developed Corinthian order colonnade, including dentils on the entablature used on the exterior of a building. There was only one monarch, Ionian or Macedonian, likely to have employed architects who were cosmopolitan enough to attempt the Corinthian, and that monarch was Philip V, who was legendary for his Aegean-wide building program. And recall that Polybius reports that Philip fortified Bylazora. In our article in Volume 3 of the Bylazora publication, we had postulated that the exterior courtyard of the palace, at the foot of the monumental stairway, might be encased by the palace wall on the south and another wall to the north. After TFAHR left the Bylazora excavations, another team did a small excavation here and found the wall we had predicted to the north. The odd thing about this northern wall was that it met the monumental stairway at a 45-degree angle and not at a 90-degree angle like the palace wall. But this now explains the orientation of the stoa. We know now what the stoa looked onto.
Now let's enter the palace. Once you pass between the 2 Corinthian columns at the top of the stairway, you find yourself in a vestibule whose walls were plastered and painted red. We found evidence of this plaster along 2 of the 3 walls. Leading out of the vestibule are a doorway immediately ahead of you and one on the right. The threshold blocks of these 2 doorways can still be seen. Both of the threshold blocks have cuttings in them to hold panels, probably wooden panels, that would have masked the crude work of the door jambs. In fact, all of the threshold blocks that we've uncovered so far in the palace have these cuttings. TFAHR archaeologist Frederick Mej researched these threshold blocks and came up with this tentative reconstruction. Mej remarks in his article for Volume 3 of the Bylazora publication that the Bylazora threshold blocks are very similar to the threshold blocks of the Hellenistic mansions at Eretria, which are dated to the very late 4th and 3rd centuries BC.
The entrance immediately opposite the Corinthian facade was cleared in 2014. It immediately veers to the south. It is, therefore, a perfect circumbendibus, which is a good defensive device for a palace garrison post. The entrance to the right, labeled C in the photograph, was probably the main entrance to the palace. It's wider and longer and could possibly be another circumbendibus. It is not fully excavated, so we can't know for sure. The walls of the entrance hall beyond were plastered and painted red and black. A large pithos stood in one corner to provide visitors to the palace with water for washing or refreshment before they would proceed further into the palace. Now, it was during the excavation of this entrance hall that we found beneath the roof tile fall a grayware pitcher of the 3rd to 2nd century BC, the remnants of an iron box, 2 stones with definite signs of anathyrosis, and a plate whose production lifespan was the 5th to the 3rd century BC.
Immediately, one of our colleagues argued that this plate dated the construction of the palace to the 5th century BC. We were thrown by the suggestion that one might date the construction of a building by an artifact found on the floor of the building in an essentially unsealed strata. Aside from the fact that we found plenty of 4th, 3rd, and 2nd century BC pottery in other parts of the palace, we could not understand dating the construction of the palace by a single plate on the floor. Let's illustrate why this dating methodology doesn't hold up. We live in a house built in 1997. We have in our office some plates we picked up in a flea market in Turkey one year. They are Armenian, and one of them is dated to 1767. Let's say, God behüte, our house burns down with all our stuff in it. 1,000 years later, some archaeologists excavate the ruins. They find the Armenian plate, and one archaeologist immediately concludes that the house was built in 1767. But another archaeologist examines the construction debris: electrical sockets, cable outlets, iron rebars, and fiber cement siding material. He then says, the house can't have been built in 1767. It's wired for electricity, there are rebars in the foundation, and fiber cement siding wasn't invented in America until the late 20th century. It's more likely a late 20th century house.
The second archaeologist is of course correct. It's more reliable to date a building by construction details than by something found on the floor of the building. The question then becomes, if the house can be dated by construction technique to the late 20th century, how do we explain the 18th century plate in it? Well, think of a logical possibility. Maybe this was the house of a collector, somebody who collected antiques. Well, that's essentially the situation we're in with the palace. The construction details of the palace, the Corinthian capitals, the Corinthian facade, the threshold cuttings, all lead us to a date in the 3rd century BC, the time of Philip V. So what's a 5th or 4th century plate doing in the building? Well, it's a royal palace after all, and maybe all sorts of antique items were stored there. It would not surprise us if much older pottery, or even non-Macedonian or non-Paeonian pottery, would eventually be found in the palace.
Let's continue our tour of the palace. From this entrance hall, we turn to the right and enter what is probably the interior courtyard of the palace, if the Bylazora palace follows a typical Macedonian palace plan. We expect future excavations to uncover a colonnade for the internal courtyard. We do know that the walls of the inner courtyard were plastered and painted, and here we discovered 2 more interesting construction details. First, the plaster in the courtyard was rabbeted, or rebated near the floor. That is, 2 vertical planes of plaster are joined by a small horizontal ledge of plaster set at a 90-degree angle to both vertical planes. This type of rabbeting of plasterwork is first attested in Aegean architecture in the early 3rd century BC and will continue to be fashionable well into the 1st century BC. Another interesting touch: several plaster fragments show data lines, dividing the plaster into what was meant to look like blocks of stones. This is another decorative plaster style of the late Hellenistic period. Those of you who have studied Roman art and architecture will recognize it as the immediate forerunner of the first Pompeian style. The style of plasterwork is another reason we dated the palace to the time of Philip V.
From the inner courtyard we enter the anteroom to the Tholos. Like the Macedonian palace at Aigai, the Bylazora palace has a Tholos right next to the entrance hall. We found enough architectural fragments to partially reconstruct the entrance to this anteroom with its single Doric column. We come next to the Tholos. The Greek word tholos simply refers to a round room or building, usually serving some sort of religious function. The Bylazora tholos was unplastered and unpainted, which might be an atavistic touch for a room that probably served a religious function. We can't be sure of the function of the tholos. It might have served as a throne room, some sort of shrine, or even a reception hall or dining hall. In a shallow pit in the dirt floor of the tholos, the excavators found a skyphos, along with some bird bones and a bird figurine. But an even more interesting find was this: fragments of a grayware crater with strange designs on the rim and shoulder. We sent photos of these pieces to archaeologists and museums all over Europe for help with identification. The near unanimous reply was that these symbols look Celtic, from the late 3rd to early 1st century BC. This was a time when Celtic symbols in art became so abstract that they became all but unrecognizable. One symbol we thought might be a bird. For the other symbol, the suggestions have been a hut, a temple, a house, a burial mound, a sacred mountain, a tholos, a thumb grip, a helmet, and a shield. We have found only remote parallels to it and are at something of a loss in interpreting it.
But what's a Celtic crater doing in a Macedonian palace? We of course don't know for sure, but it's possible there's a connection with the Bastarnae, the Celtic allies of Philip V and Perseus. We know the Celtic Bastarnae passed through Paeonia to do battle with the Dardanians, the northern enemies of the Macedonians. If the Dardanians, years before, had traditionally raided Macedonia by way of Bylazora, as Polybius says, why not bring the Bastarnae to Dardania through Bylazora as well, but going in the opposite direction? Just a theory.
The last room of the palace we'll visit is the kitchen. It was the first room we had started to excavate in 2011. It occupies one corner of one of the wings of the palace, the corner with the 105-degree angle. It is the room closest to the city gate, and it is the room in the worst state of preservation. And that may be due to the fact that when the palace was being dismantled after the defeat of the Macedonians by the Romans, the dismantling operations on the palace started near the city gate. In any case, one of the exterior walls of the kitchen has been quarried away down to its foundations, the wall you see in the center of the photograph, and the other is preserved only 2 courses high. The kitchen was divided into a number of smaller rooms. The dividing walls between the rooms were also quarried away down into their foundations. We could trace them, however, by following the surviving lines of the plaster veneer that once covered the walls. These kitchen walls had foundation courses of stone surmounted by mud brick. The mud brick was then plastered over and painted. We found plenty of painted plaster fragments in the kitchen rooms.
Most of the pottery from the kitchen was utilitarian courseware, as one might expect to find in a working kitchen. We discovered fragments of about a dozen amphoras, half of them Macedonian table amphoras, which are dated to the 3rd to 2nd centuries BC. We found mounds of ashes and burnt mud brick in the kitchen, attesting to its destruction by fire. Amidst all this burnt material, we also found a silver bracelet decorated with snake heads. Local Macedonian archaeologist Vladimir Atanesov called it a child's bracelet and dated it to the 5th century BC. Maybe it was an heirloom worn by one of the children who work in the kitchen. Finally, we found some very well preserved burnt beams from the kitchen ceiling. They were analyzed and declared to be conifers, which are rare today in this particular part of Macedonia. So, what can we conclude about the palace?
We believe the Bylazora Palace was started by Philip V after his conquest of the city in 217 BC, as per Polybius. The palace continued to be used during the reign of Philip's son Perseus, who had planned to send troops there, according to Livy. The palace was never completed by the time Perseus was defeated and captured by the Romans after the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC, and the palace fell out of use then. We'd like to conclude this video with a short discussion of the evidence supporting these conclusions about who built the palace and when it went out of use.
Polybius specifically said that Philip V captured and fortified the Ionian city of Bylazora to put an end to Dardanian invasions into Macedonia. The palace, which should be viewed more as a combination of palace and army garrison post, would have been part of Philip's fortifications. Livy mentions Bylazora as a meeting place for Perseus's Gallic mercenaries in the preparation for the upcoming battle against Rome. Perseus wouldn't have sent soldiers to an abandoned or ruined city to be housed and fed. Bylazora must still have been a viable military position at that time. The emerging plan of the palace from the Bylazora excavations is beginning now to bear a marked resemblance to the plan of the ancestral palace of the Macedonian kings at Aigai, and to a lesser extent to that at Demetrius, Greece, the latter being a palace that Philip V refurbished. The Bylazora Stoa, adjacent to the palace, can be easily and accurately dated to the time of Philip V by the style of architecture, specifically the employment of the fluted, faceted column.
The facade of the Bylazora Palace is a full Corinthian order facade, meaning that it employs all the elements of the classic Corinthian order from plinth up to the cornice. These elements came together from different sources by the late 4th century BC. It defies common sense to date the Bylazora Corinthian facade as earlier than the appearances of the Corinthian order in external use at Athens or Samothrace, the mid-3rd century. Moreover, we do not accept our colleagues' interpretation of the Bylazora Palace's architectonic elements as a native Ionian style. There is not a single stone discovered from the facade that does not neatly correspond to the traditional parts of the Corinthian order, and there is not any structural evidence that the facade was a later addition to the palace. The plasterwork in the palace, the rabbit and dado edgings, is Hellenistic, common from the late 3rd century BC. The workmanship of the threshold blocks is also Hellenistic, common from the late 4th to 3rd century BC.
We also reject the premise of some of our colleagues that the palace must be dated principally by a few select items found on the floor of the building, such as a silver bracelet or a piece of pottery dated to the 5th century BC. First, older, contemporary, or newer items can be brought into any building at any time. Second, some of the pottery found does indeed date much later than the 5th century BC. Moreover, the unfinished Corinthian capitals and the unfinished plasterwork in the anteroom to the Tholos are evidence that the work on the palace was never finished.
From what Diodorus Siculus tells us of Rome's strategy toward Macedonia after Pydna, it is most likely that the Romans destroyed, looted, and quarried away the stones of Bylazora. But we'll have more to say on that in the last video of this series.